Okay, hi everyone. Absolutely wonderful to see so many people here tonight. I'm actually speaking to you from the UK, from Leamington Spa, which is in the middle of the UK, near Stratford-upon-Avon, where Shakespeare was born. And it's rather dark and cold here today. Maybe it's a little bit warmer where you are. I don't know. I guess it depends where you are in Spain. So, as Neil said, psychology and motivation and mindset is a great interest of mine, along with teaching, of course. And so in this session, really, I want to look at how we can help our students to become more motivated by looking at growth mindset in particular. So first question then to think about, I think, is why are some students unmotivated? We've all got them, haven't we? We've all got students who just really don't seem to be that interested in learning English or in focusing in class. Why do you think that is? I mean, there are some possibilities here. You know, sometimes we think it might be that they're distracted by technology, too busy looking at their phones. Maybe their parents don't push them hard enough. Maybe their parents push them too hard. Do you have any other ideas? Why are some students unmotivated? You could write your ideas in the chat box if you like. Let's see what anybody thinks. Okay, they don't like English, yeah? That can certainly be a problem. Any other ideas? Okay, English is compulsory. Yeah, absolutely. We'll get to that a little bit later. Too much focus on grades. Yeah, so that can be demotivating. It's too difficult. Right. They also have their own teenage problems. Absolutely. I've got two teenagers, my children, and I'm very well aware of how much their life gets in the way of their studies. There are lots and lots of good examples here, I think, of why students might be unmotivated. Unfortunately, many of them are things that we as teachers can't actually do very much about. We can't help them in terms of, I don't know, them being fed up with school, for example, or having their own problems as teenagers. But I think what we can do is to help them to understand how their own minds can be holding them back. So, when you look at children at primary age, they often have a natural love of learning, and this tends to disappear for many students by the time they get to secondary school. They've already decided, oh, I'm not very good at English, or I can't do this, I can't do that. They're also often very self-conscious. They don't want to make mistakes. They think that they will lose face. So they're actually holding themselves back in many ways. And so what I'd like to do in this session is to look at some things that we could do in the classroom with students to try and change the way that they look at themselves and at learning. And specifically, I'm thinking about having what's often called a fixed mindset. So I'm going to look in a little bit more detail now at what we mean by a fixed mindset. Because I think if we can unfix that mindset, we can free them to learn and to use their English to make their lives better in the long run. Okay, so here we've got some sentences. As you can see, they're in pairs, 1 and 2, 1 and 2. I'd just like you to look at the sentences, and this is thinking about you now, not your students. Okay, how do you feel about these sentences? Which sentence in each pair do you agree with most? Okay, so take a few minutes to look at them. If you want to write your answers in the chat box, you can, but you don't have to. So choose which sentence in each pair you agree with most, for you, not for your students. This is for you. Okay, I'll give you another few seconds. Okay, there's a lot of ones, although I see Clara says the students would probably choose number 2s. You might well be right. Okay, so here are the same sentences, but I've highlighted some of the sentences in green. Okay? So the green sentences represent what is sometimes called growth mindset, and the black sentences represent what is called a fixed mindset. Okay, so it doesn't matter what you chose, right? But although you might think about this afterwards, but if you chose the more green ones, then you have more of a growth mindset. If you chose more black ones, you have more of a fixed mindset. So fixed and growth mindsets, these terms come from Carol S. Dweck in her book called Mindset. And she differentiates between these two ways of looking at learning. So if you have a fixed mindset, you believe that intelligence is static. In other words, that the intelligence you have stays the same, right? And it can't grow in any way. If you have a growth mindset, you believe that intelligence can be developed, and that if you work at it, you can become better at things. Now, lots of people were brought up to have a fixed mindset. For example, thinking about myself, my mother often would say to me, "Oh, you're just like me. I was no good at mathematics either. We're just much better at languages in our family." Now, she meant to be encouraging to me, but she was teaching me to have a fixed mindset about my ability in mathematics. So I believed that I somehow was genetically not very good at mathematics. And this had the impact that I didn't do very well at mathematics. And maybe I actually could have done much better than I thought I could. But I had this fixed mindset. So when you have a fixed mindset and you believe that intelligence is static, the important thing for you in the classroom is that you want to look smart. If you have a growth mindset, the important thing is that you want to learn and develop. And this has all sorts of effects on what happens in the classroom. So, for example, if you have a fixed mindset, you will tend to avoid challenge because you don't want to risk making a mistake. If you have a growth mindset, you'll enjoy challenge because you understand that making mistakes is part of the process. Similarly, a fixed mindset, you'll tend to give up easily when you hit an obstacle. A growth mindset, you'll persist even when there are obstacles because you know that you have to go through these in order to learn. If you have a fixed mindset, you might feel embarrassed about having to make an effort. You might feel that, if you were clever enough, you wouldn't have to make an effort. If you have a growth mindset, you see effort as part of the path towards mastering whatever it is that you're studying, in this case, a language. And if you have a fixed mindset, then you are likely to ignore feedback, or you might even feel humiliated by feedback because you feel it shows that you're not very good at something. Whereas a growth mindset, you're able to learn from criticism and see it as part of the process. So it's quite easy, I think, to see how having a growth mindset can help with the motivation to learn. But how do we help our students to develop a growth mindset if they don't already have one, or if they've already learnt from their parents or maybe from other teachers that, to have a fixed mindset? How can we actually shift their perception? Right? That's the major question, isn't it? Okay. So I think there are several things to think about. First of all, this is very important, trial and error. Right. Does anybody here play the violin? Anybody? Or do you have children who play the violin? Maybe even more important. Right. Oh, we've got some no's. Have you ever heard somebody who's learning to play the violin? It's a beautiful instrument, but when somebody is learning to play it, it sounds horrendous. It sounds like a cat is being tortured. Right? But in order to learn to play the violin, you have to go through that process of sounding terrible. Right? And it's just part of learning to play the violin. Right? Unless you're a child genius like Mozart or something. Carmen says, my neighbour plays the violin. I hope they're not a beginner for your sake. Right? So part of the process of learning anything is accepting that you have to go through a period where you're perhaps not very good at it and you have to practice and improve. In English, we have that expression, practice makes perfect. Right? So what does that actually mean in terms of what we do in the classroom? Well, okay, first of all, I think repetition. Right? Scott Thornbury on his excellent blog, The A to Z of ELT, has a post called R for repetition. And he says, when learners repeat a task, even a relatively long time after its first performance, gains have been shown in both fluency and linguistic complexity. So repetition is actually something that's really important in learning. And yet very often, I think both teachers and students tend to kind of avoid repeating things because there's this feeling that it might be demotivating or it might be boring to repeat something. And I'd like you to really think about that assumption because I believe that so long as you change some aspects of the task, so for example, if students have been talking to a partner, you might give them a new partner to talk to about the same thing. So that would change some aspect of the task so it wasn't boring for them. But the second time that they do the task, I can pretty much guarantee that it will be much better. As Scott Thornbury says, both more fluent and linguistically more complex. And when students see that improvement, that's very motivating for them, in fact. Related to this is the idea of planning. When we ask students to carry out a writing task, we very often give them planning time. But with speaking, we don't do it quite so often, and yet I think there is a very strong argument for giving planning time before speaking. And research shows that, in fact, the quality, as Scott Thornbury said with repetition, but the quality of both the fluency and the complexity improves if you give planning time. Now, I don't mean asking your students to write something down and then they read it aloud, but actually giving them some time to think about it can really help, because research shows that students often find it very, very difficult to think about the content of what they're saying and to communicate and to be accurate all at the same time. And so planning time can reduce some of that pressure. And in writing, we often do get students to draft, but how often do we actually look at those drafts? I would suggest probably not that often. And in fact, it can be very helpful to mark the drafts and to make students aware of how they've improved through the drafts. So the suggestion I've put here is, ask students to show evidence of their working. When people teach mathematics, students are often asked to show their working, as in how they came to the answer to the sum. And we can do the same thing with writing. and we can help them to focus on how they've actually improved. And it's also about helping them to see that making a mistake is really just part of the process. I love this quote from, I think it's Caleb Gattegno, if I pronounce that correctly. He was the originator of the silent way method of teaching, which is something that was quite popular, I believe, in the 1970s. Even I am not old enough to actually remember teaching in the 1970s. But this quote is one that I use quite often because it gives, I think it's so important that students understand that a mistake is not something to be avoided. It can actually be something that will help not just them, but possibly the whole class to really understand something. So what can we do to celebrate mistakes? So one practical idea that you could use is to ask students to actually keep a mistake log. So students will actually write down a mistake that they made either in their homework or in class and think about what caused you to make this mistake. You know, why did you make the mistake? Was it that you didn't understand something, or was it that you got confused with something in your first language, or was it just a slip? And what did you learn from the mistake? And by actually focusing on mistakes this way, they can start to see what they can actually learn from mistakes, which is a lot. You know, Susanna's saying so mistake logs are a great idea, but hard to do on a regular basis. I mean, I think if you have a sheet of paper like this that they keep in the back of their exercise book, you can get them to do it quite regularly, or, you know, if they finish an activity earlier, that could be something that they could just turn to, and they could just write down a couple of mistakes from the class so far. Some teachers even have mistake quotas, in fact, that should say, rather than mistake logs. I don't know what happened there. But they set a quota for the number of mistakes. I obviously made a mistake on this slide. There you go. And they say to the students, okay, I expect you to make at least 3 mistakes. You know, and if you haven't made any, then the work clearly isn't challenging enough for you. So I think this is a good way of looking at it, because if students are producing, let's say, a piece of written work with no mistakes in it at all, then they aren't taking any risks, and they need to be taking risks, because taking risks and sometimes making mistakes is definitely how we learn. So it's about changing our perception, if you like, and our students' perception. And I think another thing that is very important in terms of this is the language that we use. Okay, so this is a classic example. All right, the parrot on the right is the student, and the parrot on the left is the teacher. So it's a very small change in terms of language, but it's a huge change in terms of perception. You know, so the student who says, oh, I can't do it, and the teacher says, you know, you can't do it yet, right? It's a process. And we really do need to think about the language that we use, because it can have a huge impact on our students and on how they perceive themselves and their learning. So here's some examples of typical things that teachers often say to students. Okay, examples of praise, these are. Now, these are very nice things to say, of course, but there could be a problem with saying these things to students. What do you think the problem could be with saying things like this? Just write your ideas in the chat box. Yeah, so what do you think could be a problem with saying things like this? Okay, I've seen a few people about, yes, you don't offer a challenge. Thomas, you said they don't refer to their effort. Absolutely. No room for improvement. Okay, yeah, Lourdes, you're saying you're praising their intelligence. Absolutely right. Right. The problem with saying things like this, okay, is that you are contributing possibly to a fixed mindset. So if you say you did brilliantly as usual, you're saying, oh yes, you know, you're always good and you're going to stay good. And same with, you know, you're really clever. And great answer, well, yes, but, you know, why is it a great answer? So there you're not actually challenging them in any way. So here are some suggestions, right, as to what you could say instead. I'll just give you a minute to read those. Okay, so you can see here, I think there are two key points here. You know, first of all, it's really important to say why something was good. So maybe instead of you're really clever, you could say, well, you've done really well today because you kept going when you hit a problem. And instead of just saying that's a great answer, you could ask them to explain why that was a good answer. You know, Anna says, what about good job? Yeah, good job, great to say that's a good job, but why was it a good job? You know, get them to explore a little bit more. Ask questions. So say why something was good, or get them to say why something was good, and think about what's the next step. You know, how could you increase the challenge next time? What else could you do with this answer, or so on. And yes, so by doing this, you're showing your growth mindset, and you're helping them to see that it's not just about showing that they're intelligent, but it's actually a process of learning, and you know, which can involve making mistakes, and that's fine so long as you're learning from it. So approaching feedback in this way, I think, is a very important part of building motivation. Because, you know, if students believe that they have a fixed amount of intelligence or a fixed ability at language, that's not very motivating because there's nowhere to go. Whereas by praising them in this kind of way that's in the green, you're showing them, you know, where they need to go next, or helping them to discover where they need to go next, which is obviously much more motivating. And the same thing goes for giving them feedback. So I'm sure you've heard of these two different kinds of motivation. So intrinsic motivation comes from within, and it's about wanting to be autonomous, to master something, having your own sense of purpose. And extrinsic motivation comes from the outside, and it's about getting some kind of compensation for what you do, or possibly being punished if you don't do it well, getting a reward. So which of these do you think is more motivating for students, intrinsic or extrinsic? Okay, Beatrice was quick. Yeah. Oh, there's more coming. Yes. All right. So intrinsic motivation has been shown in lots of research to be much more motivating. And this is the kind of motivation that small children often have. They just want to learn something for the sake of learning it. Once we get to secondary age children, often they're starting to lose that intrinsic motivation, and it becomes much more about doing it to get a reward, or doing it because your parents will be cross with you if you don't, or so on. And, you know, that will have some positive effect, but it is nowhere near as effective as if you can trigger intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation is all about them taking responsibility for their learning themselves. And this is really what we're talking about here. So when it comes to giving students feedback, we've talked about praise, but what about specific feedback? Okay, so some principles of feedback here. These are my principles of feedback. These are things that I think are very important to think about. So first of all, feedback should involve more work for the students than for the teacher. So in terms of written work, I think this is the most obvious example. I'm sure that all of you, like me, have spent a long time, hours, writing careful feedback on students' written work, only to see the student glance at it quickly, possibly looking for a grade, and then they shove it in their bag, and you know that they are never going to look at that feedback again. Has that happened to you? Yeah. Okay, yeah. I mean, I'd be very surprised if it hadn't. I think it happens to every teacher. All right, so we need to find ways of giving them feedback that makes them do the work rather than us. Because, hey, we already speak pretty good English. Second point, I think feedback should not be too supportive. Now, I don't mean you should be horrid to them, but I think we need to, again, it's about making them do the work, if you like. You know, we have an expression in English, you know, to pushing the baby birds out of the nest. All right. When baby birds start to fly, at some point their parents actually push them out of the nest so that they can fly. And if we are too supportive to students, if we keep telling them the same things again and again and again without actually expecting them to improve or to take the feedback on board, then we're not actually helping them. All right. So I think that's important to think about. And finally, and this is a really interesting point, I think, grades and feedback are completely different things. And I would suggest that it's better not to mix the two of them. You know, when students look at the written work really quickly and they're just looking for the grade, right, if they are focused on a grade, it's been shown in research that they are much less likely to take on any of the feedback. They're only looking for the number. So you might consider not giving a grade if you can within your school system and giving feedback, or giving a grade and not giving feedback on that occasion because they're not going to look at it anyway. So it's interesting to think about that. They're different things and they have different purposes and different effects. Okay, so let's look at some actual activities that you could use in the class in terms of feedback that would help to encourage a growth mindset. Right, so the first thing I wanted to talk about is what's known in the UK school system as DIRT. DIRT is an acronym and it stands for Dedicated Independent Reflection Time. Right, dedicated independent reflection time. And it's become quite popular within UK schools. And what it is it's a time set aside. It might just be 15 minutes or something, or it might be longer, in the class where students actually have the time to look at and respond to feedback. And there are lots of ways that we can do that within a language class as well. So, for example, somebody says, is it a kind of diary? It could be a diary, but there are lots of different ways you can do it. So target lists is one activity that works well. So what you do with the target lists is, instead of giving every individual learner feedback on their written work, which we know takes hours, you could make a list from having looked at all of their work of 10 targets that you think apply to many students in the class. So you come up with 10 things that most students have problems with, quite a few of them. So you put the targets on the board and then you give the students a set amount of time and you ask them to choose a number of those targets, 2 or 3, it depends how much time you're giving them, and they have to apply those targets to their written work before handing it in to you again. So they're improving those specific things. Compare two pieces of work. So what you would do there is you would get students to look at a piece of work that they handed in at the beginning of the academic year, and then at a piece of work that they've just done, and to write down, let's say, 5 ways in which their writing has improved over the year. So again, that's getting them to analyse their work themselves, and that it's quite motivating because they can see how they've improved. Gallery critique. A lot of teachers have activities where students look at each other's work and they do peer feedback. There are benefits to doing this, but there are also downsides. One of the downsides is if a student is partnered with another student whose English is not as good as theirs, they're going to get a limited amount of feedback on their work. So what you do in gallery critique is you put the pieces of work up on the wall and you give students post-it notes, and they have to go around and make one comment on a post-it note on each piece of written work. They need some training in doing this because you've got to help them to be able to give feedback which is specific, which is helpful, which is kind. But it does give every student a variety of feedback. And of course, the teacher can also add some feedback if there's something that has been missed out that the student needs to know. Margin marking. I think most teachers probably have used a correction code. So you know where you put like SP for spelling or WW for wrong word. Margin marking is a bit like that, but it's less work for the teacher because you simply make a note in the margin of the problem and the students have to find the problem and correct it. So it's a little bit more challenging. And finally, using dots. So this is something that you could use in what's called live marking. So live marking is where you are monitoring the class while they're working on something, let's say, an exercise, a grammar exercise maybe. And instead of actually going and helping them to correct a mistake, you just put a dot next to the mistake or next to the sentence which is wrong, and then give them some more time to try to correct it themselves. Okay, so there are 5 possible activities that you could do in a DIRT session. Which one of those activities do you like the sound of the most and why? You write in the chat box. Or if there's any questions. Yeah, oh, there's a good variety. Okay, well, that's good because that means different people like different things, which works. So try them out. Okay, so basically the more you can get students to take responsibility for their own learning, the more motivated they're likely to become. And, equally, the more choices you give them, the more motivated they are likely to be. So here are some examples of research which backs up this idea. You can find sort of more detail on these on this link here, which will be on the PDF that you get. So here are 3 examples of research that showed how giving students choice led to more motivation. I'll just give you a minute to read it. Okay, so I think these are quite interesting because some of these are things that I think as teachers we might be a bit nervous about doing. So getting students to decide for themselves. But these are three clear examples of where giving students that responsibility led to much more engagement and much more motivation. So I think it's really worth thinking about that in terms of, how you approach students. The more that you do for them, the more you are likely to be undermining their motivation. Okay, so last but not least, relationships, particularly teacher-student relationships, are incredibly important in terms of motivation. So, perhaps the first thing we need to ask ourselves, I think, in terms of what we can do as teachers is to think about, is every student in the class really participating? Now, we tend to assume that they are, but actually it's often just the same few students who are offering ideas or answering questions. So one thing I would recommend is to actually objectively analyse the interaction in your class. So you might get somebody, a colleague, for example, to come in and observe you and actually note down which students are participating when, or you might have the class videoed, or you might simply just record the class on your phone just for your own personal analysis. It really is worth doing. It's difficult, I think, to do as a teacher because we don't really like to watch ourselves teach or what have you, but it can be really interesting. The second thing that you can do to help students participate is to increase what's known as wait time. And wait time is how long teachers wait after asking a question and before they accept an answer. How long do you think teachers wait on average after asking a question and before they accept an answer? Have a guess. How many seconds? Okay, less than 40, says Beatrice. 1 minute, 30 seconds, 10 seconds. Too little, yes. Well, I can tell you, you're going to be quite surprised, I think. It's 1.5 seconds is the average, according to research. 1.5 seconds. It's not long, is it? And it doesn't give many students a chance to answer, right? Unless they've got the answer immediately there. If you can extend that time to just 3 seconds, that will make a huge difference because it will give far more students a chance to either think about it or to gain the confidence to offer an answer. It will really improve the interaction in your class. So try just noticing what happens when you ask a question. And if you've got students immediately answering, try to get them to wait until you're ready to nominate who you want to answer. Just 3 seconds makes a huge difference. And yes, a no hands up policy, you can do that. That can help, I think. Okay, third point. This is a fairly obvious one, but it's important. So use more small groups because that obviously gives students more chance to participate, and allocate specific roles within that group. I'll give you an example of this in a minute. And finally, talk to your learners about the issue of participation, and get them to take responsibility for it. Okay, so I said I would come up with a specific example. This is a really good way, I think, of getting students to work together in small groups more productively, because what often happens is that one student takes over. And this is a way of avoiding that. So this comes from Jill Hadfield's book, Classroom Dynamics, which I very much recommend, actually. It has lots of practical ideas for improving classroom dynamics, and it's called Scribe. And what she suggests is that in each group, you allocate one group member to take notes while the others talk, and then that person, who is called the scribe, feeds back to the class at the end. Now, this works brilliantly if you have a student who tends to dominate because they are not allowed to talk during the activity, but they get to talk at the end. It also works equally well if you have somebody who doesn't contribute much to the group, because it gives them a very specific task to do. And although they have to feed back to the class at the end, they are prepared to do that because they've been making notes and they're ready to do it. So this works very well, I think, in terms of small groups. Okay. Something else that we can do with students is to actually try to communicate more with them ourselves. And I think, often we have students that we find a little bit difficult, right? And those are the students that we really, really need to get to know, in my experience. Sometimes you won't be able to get through to them, but some of my favourite students that I've remembered for years have been those that initially I found difficult and that I then made an effort to get to know. So one idea is to have a dialogue journal, and you can read about this on this website, Cult of Pedagogy. But basically, the student and you write letters back and forth to each other. So you don't correct the English because this isn't a language activity. This is about getting to know each other and building a relationship. But of course, it is still good practice for English, and you're giving them a model in your letters. Another idea for building relationships with students is known as 2 times 10, and you can read about it on this blog. And this was Angela Watson blogs about it here, and basically what she did was she chose some students who she felt were underperforming, and she spent 2 minutes a day for 10 days talking to those students, just chatting to them about their lives. And you can read about it on this blog post, but essentially there was a huge improvement in both their engagement and also in the quality of their work. And I think also, communication goes both ways, and I think we need to keep in touch with our students' culture. So we need to understand what's going on in their lives, what's interesting for them, what kind of thing they're making jokes about, what are the latest memes that are going around. And we also need to share something of our life, right? So this is an example. This is my dog, who's called Teddy, and he is a schnoodle, which is a Schnauzer Poodle cross, and he gets up to all kinds of naughty things. So this is the kind of thing that you could tell your students about, share something of your life. To give another example, I remember a group of students I had in Poland who were beginners, and they were quite embarrassed, I think, about being beginners and not being very good at English. And so I got into telling them every week I would tell them about the latest mistakes that I had made in my attempts to learn Polish, which they thought was absolutely hilarious. But it also helped them to see that, making mistakes when you're a beginner is just part of the process. And finally, as well as all the, the nice kind of stuff, we also need to run towards trouble sometimes. Right. So as Jim Sturtevant says in his book, You've Got to Connect, which is all about relationships between teachers and students, he says, be on the lookout for difficult times, blow up setbacks, failures, hurts, disappointments, and resolve problems in a constructive, respectful way, and your connection to those students will be stronger. So you don't need to avoid difficulties either, because actually sometimes this is the best way to bond with students, is to help them in a difficult time. So the question then, I think, isn't really why are some students unmotivated? It's more, what can we do to encourage students' motivation? And we've looked at quite a few examples in the webinar. So to summarize, all right, first of all, this idea that difficulty can actually be desirable. I've put that in quotation marks because there's a lot of research into something called desirable difficulty. So actually stretching students and getting them to see that not being able to do something immediately and having to work at it, having to repeat and practice is good. Because learning requires repetition, trial and error and mistakes. Remember, it isn't a question of I can't do it. It's always a question of I can't do it yet. All right? You just need, more practice or to understand it better or whatever. Important point here, praise. It really needs to be specific, not just, oh, you're great, and related to effort, all right? So that you're helping students to see that it isn't about them having a fixed amount of ability or intelligence. Autonomy, giving all students autonomy and choice is vital. And finally, relationships definitely matter, and it's something that we need to be very conscious of and working on. So I've come to the end of the webinar, but I'm very happy to answer any questions if anybody's got any. Fire away. Or if there was any questions on the way through that I missed. Okay, any questions in the chat box? Gerald says, do you think it would be okay for students to do a mistake log in their own language? Yes, I don't see why not. I mean, I think the point is to be thinking about the mistake and what you have gained from spotting that mistake and kind of how you're going to possibly try and avoid it in the future. So I see no reason why that couldn't be in their own language. Anna says, need some time to process. Yeah, there's quite a lot in there. I agree. I need to get rid of my fixed mindset first. Yeah, I mean, I think lots of us have that because of the way we've been brought up, like my fixed mindset about maths. And I'm really having to watch what I say to my children, about things like that, so I don't repeat it. Anna says, could you return to the mistakes recording? Oh, to see the slide again? I think we can, yes. Hang on. There we go. That's the one, yes. What was the meaning of the lists you mentioned? Do you mean the target list? So you would choose things that most students were having problems with within the writing. And then students would choose, say you had 10 targets, they would choose 2 or 3 that they think apply to them and try to improve their writing in those areas. I'm just looking at some other questions. Regina says, I found my students are not motivated because I speak in English and they don't understand me. I tell them that it takes time, but they're not patient enough. I mean, I think that's true. I think to a degree it does just take time and encouragement, and just keeping it really simple to begin with. And you don't necessarily, I suppose it depends on the context you work in, but you don't necessarily have to do everything in English, for example. You could just do it for part of the lesson and then build it up so that you're doing more and more.